Welcome to the Content Podcast, conversations with Silicon Valley's creatives. I'm Daniel Garcia, your host and the cultivator of Content Magazine, published by SV Creates. This episode of the Content Magazine podcast is brought to you by Bonfire, a Silicon Valley digital agency building elevated websites for ambitious brands. Find out more about Bonfire at bonfire.com. Today we talk with Conrad Egyir. He's a Ghanaian artist based out of Detroit and has a current exhibition called Chapters of Light on exhibit at the Institute of Contemporary Art in San Jose. First, thank you for taking the time and being out here in San Jose, and excited about your new work, Chapters of Light. So this is the first time that this series has been displayed, is that right?
Correct.
And it's a little different, right? Because you have more color and more of a background than like your other work.
Absolutely.
And what was the reason for that?
Yeah, this is something that I started from grad school, which is the Cranbrook Academy of Arts in 2016 to 2018, where most of my work was centered around having the figures be both the background and in the foreground and have them carry the weight of the narrative. So I wasn't very much interested in occupying the background with some architectural space, but like later on throughout the years, I had much more of a turn and shift, thinking about how the background could also like add as an extra layer to the narrative. So I started thinking about domestic spaces and seeing how the characters fit into like different worlds. So I'll often have my models come into the studio with a white background wall with nothing on the wall, and then I edit them through Photoshop and superimpose them and totally made up, realms, so to speak. So.
Yeah. So even then, for instance, the clothes that they're wearing, is that something that you do later? You kind of like create that, and then you're mainly. I'm kind of curious about the process.
Oh yeah. So they come in with their own. Maybe I'll normally tell them to come in maybe with like 4 to 5 best attires out of their wardrobe. So they do their own personal creation. They come into the studio, or I go to their place of residence, and then we look through the wardrobe. And I'm particularly drawn to like colors that are popping or seasonal uniforms. But then during my editorial phase, I'll still switch out the colors. So there are some examples where I could show you around. Like this pink one, for example, he had some black pants and a brown top. But then looking at the totality of the show, I try to like create this monochromatic palette for each painting. So I went totally pink on that one.
Yeah. So, like for instance, let's take what's the name of this piece, the pink one?
Mediums of Salt and Love.
And for this piece, then the pose. Then was he sitting in that pose originally when you did the photo, or even that is kind of?
Yeah, he was. So normally I'll tell them a specific pose or idea that I'm trying to go for, but then I find it also interesting where I'm able to catch them in between poses while they do their own natural take, natural adjustments, and I find those much more appealing, more so than the very stiff, hands-on approach that I like them to pose in. So
yeah, that's cool. I mean, I do a lot of photography, and mainly portrait photography, so I am a little interested in the photo aspect of it. I imagine, I could see, right, in 10, 15 years, you have just a photo show too, right? That'd be kind of fun.
People have been talking about this, everywhere I'm going, it's yeah, you have a very big photographic background. What do you think about that? And I've been having to think about that for the last 2 years and see how I could take on that discipline, as in unison with the printing practice. So it's something I'm thinking about.
Yeah, the behind the scenes. For Chapters of Light, well, you're continuing to use words with your paintings, which you've done in the past with your other kind of shows. So these with the books, though, there's a very much kind of like a theme going on with books. What's the reason in these chapters in these books? What's the connection that you're trying to communicate?
Right. So this little piece behind me, the model is Joshua Reyna. He's also a good artist of mine, a friend of mine in Detroit. So I had a photo shoot with him, and then in his apartment there were these books that were sitting on his window that I got very intrigued with. So that same night I went on Amazon looking for those same books, but what ended up happening was I bought about 200 books worth about, I don't know, like 4 grand in one sitting. And because I was just consumed with that. Because normally during my practice, I'll go online and reference certain props or like still have things I want to like include in the narrative. But I thought it would be much more interesting if I actually did that through my own personal library as opposed to going online. Uh, so during the process of like acquiring some of these books, I came across these 4 books that were just basically monochromatic historical what do you call it, accumulations of paintings that were just based on specific colors. So there was a book for red, and every painting that was just like painted with a very rich, intense red, and then there'll be a book for blue, and there'll be a book for yellow. So I thought about these singular monochromatic ways of telling a story. So that's where these chapters of light come from, And again, some of these titles have the word medium in it. So I'm thinking about the mediums, I'm thinking about the light, and also thinking about the visual metaphor or the pun uh, that goes like you don't judge a book by its cover, but in a sense you don't judge a book by its color too. So Cover or Color, and thinking about how we often judge people based on their external qualities as opposed to the content of their character.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. That's cool. That's one of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes.
Absolutely.
um, and then of course it's there's tabs like on the side of these representing, I guess, chapters. And so in portraiture in your work, you're pretty much doing portraiture. I did hear an interesting kind of like conversation. I don't know if this will make anything, but like you had procrastinated for an assignment in your undergrad, and so you did a portrait of yourself.
Jesus, yeah. All that is online, huh?
Yeah, it's online. Yeah, there's nothing about you private now. No, so which was interesting. But was that, even though that was somewhat of a mistake, but was that kind of like your beginning to kind of like do more of the portraiture and stuff?
Right. Actually, it wasn't a procrastination. It was more so like the model that I wanted to like sit for me wasn't available. It was just like veteran and this kid in Elgin, Illinois. It's about 40 minutes away from Chicago. So they weren't available on the. So yeah, actually, I take that back. I did procrastinate to the last minute, and then they were not available that Sunday evening. So what I ended up doing was, I was like, okay, I only have myself to reference, and I actually enjoyed painting black people, not because they were black, but because they were people who I was familiar with. I know I'll get that question sometimes. Why don't you paint white people? I don't.
Your network of people.
Yeah, it's basically the network of people. So I ended up like just looking in the mirror, and then, I wasn't thinking much of it. But then like I had a very great, good, positive feedback from my class and the professor, Professor Jeffrey Carl, and it became an evolution from there on out, through grad school and after grad school.
Well, it's funny. I'm always like curious, like how people, like kind of like get their voice or their style, right? And so it's interesting to see this was a little bit of a coincidence, accident, that kind of happened.
Right.
And so now it seems like you're committed in this direction, like a portraiture. What draws you into portraits?
That's a good question. It all starts from my upbringing and how I was very drawn to these stories that our elders would tell us by the fire camps, that would take us maybe like years as little kids to understand some of these like huge, grandiose fables and myths and legends. But then through school, I realized that, and this is also going to answer, I think, one of your earlier questions about the use of like text and language. My stories were becoming very dense, not because like I wanted to, but it was like a natural way of just telling the stories. I'll have symbols in there, and I'll have like different mediums and iconographies from like West Africa. So I ended up having to use language as a way to like give a little bit of access for the viewer into the work, and sometimes it will add an extra layer of like mystery, or it will help the viewer, understand maybe like certain layers that are being woven into the fabric of the piece. So the narrative do take a while to build because they're big in size, they are like multiple characters, and there's like a whole lot going on. But every now and then I find some peace and I find some rest doing just like these single portraits that don't really say much in terms of like the action that they are doing, but there's a lot that is also happening with like the little gestures that you're doing with your hands or the eye movements, and I pay attention to like the anatomy of the face, and like you could tell so many stories with like how a person sits or rests or like sleeps or just like looks at you. So that's where most of these poetry is about.
Yeah. Yeah, like this one here with it says the great reset with his hand.
Absolutely.
Right? Very kind of like power,
Power
like
pose.
a very kingly pose.
Right. It's the second time I've done that piece with that hand gesture like that.
And I saw, I think, yeah, the pink one was Salt and Love. That his hand reminds me kind of almost of the old, kind of like early church iconography. They would touch the third finger, like.
Oh,
Like how they would do that, but that's not going on in that one. Like they would do
it's funny.
they would do the third finger like to represent the Trinity or something, but that's not what's going on.
No, I like that coincidence.
It's cool though, yeah. I was wondering when I saw that one if that was going on, because I heard some of your bio that you were kind of raised in Ghana with kind of a dual kind of like Christian, kind of like Pentecost tradition and Seventh-day Adventist and kind of that. So I was wondering, what of that kind of iconography, and even like you have a couple earlier paintings with the hand that's in the air, and then there's like the tongues of fire.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm kind of curious, where is that upbringings? How are those imagery coming through, and particularly in this show?
Right. I mean, I often use biblical narratives or sacred narratives, so historically political narratives from West Africa or like America to I'll use those in a more contemporary fashion with my practice, and I've been doing that since undergrad. It's about 4 years so far. Given that these are some of the narratives that I grew up with, and that was the only way I knew how to like explore the world, through this specific lens. So there are times where I was really heavy on the religious aspect of it, just like doing undergrad, but there are times where I would have to like peel back a little bit because of the response. I'm like, yo, your work is too political, it's too religious, it's too. But then there's sometimes where like I get rebellious and I just go in extra hard on those. But I've been very settled with some of those, iconographies like the tongues or the cloves of fire over the head, or certain like hand gestures, or certain ways I title the piece, but I wouldn't use the word religious. I'm spiritual. I would like to say I do believe in God, and I'm spiritually grounded in that sense. I don't particularly just subscribe to like any specific religion, even though I come from a Christian background. But yeah, I do think about approaching or relating to people on a more spiritual level first before anything carnal, or anything casual. So
yeah. Well, do you think it's because of that? I saw, or you talk about empathy in your portrait. So talk about how do you communicate that emotion and that in portraiture?
I like this follow-up question because it helps me answer the first one. Because growing up back home, I was very divided. I mean, everything like you looked unifying on the front, but then we have, which we still do in Ghana, about like 10 to 15 political parties. I mean, in the West, it's only maybe like 2 or 3. And then Africa is one of the most like religious continents out there. And Ghana in particular has about 60% of Christians and 30% of Muslims. So most of the narratives from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed is about religion, heaven and hell, politics, who you're voting for, this, that, and the third, So it's a very divisive. It is unifying at times, but then when you dive deep down into like personal relationship with like family and friends, like it could get very tribalistic from 0 to 100 really fast. So I think about empathy and I think about the collective human spirit. It's funny because when I came to the States in 2008, I was very antisocial. I didn't even know what it meant to be black outside of the context of Ghana, because we never referred to ourselves as that back home. But then when I came to the States, I not only did I know that I was black, I also realized that I wasn't even Black American. I was African, because like I would hang around the circle of Black American friends, and I also realized how set apart I was from them. The skin color wasn't enough. Like it was my accent, it was the way I moved. So I was very antisocial. I was very conscious of myself all the time.
Because you were basically an immigrant, right? So regardless of color of skin, you have a different cultural upbringing now thrown in this American culture.
Right. Which also helped me shape the language around my work now, because coming out of undergrad to grad school, all of a sudden I had to learn about so many theories: identity politics, and black theory, queer theory, and 100 different theories about identity. I'm like, I didn't sign up for this. Like, well, what is going on? I just want to paint. But it just made me think about how we are very tribalistic in the West in our own intellectual right. Back home, it was very finite. It was about where you are from, what language you speak, and pretty much a few other couple things. But in the States, it's like an endless pool of tribalism that we don't. It is tribal as much as it is in Africa, but on a very intellectual front. And I didn't think I was ready to like subscribe to like any political ideology or religious faction. I'm pretty much very balanced given the background that I'm coming from. So in my work, I try to focus on the names and character and content of these models as opposed to their skin color, where they're from, or what they subscribe to.
So are these is this a representation of that person? Well, that's you, or is it more you're telling a story and that person is part of
telling a story and the person is part of it? So for example, sometimes people will see like a resemblance of me in a portrait. I'm like, yo, is that you? And then I'll be like, no, that's not me. That's an extension of the artist. I'm the primary focus of the piece. It's more about the story that is being told, and the model and their own personal life might add to that incrementally, but it is not like the foreground or main focus of the piece.
Yeah. Do you start then kind of more with a concept, and then you pick a model or a person to go, and then you kind of build it around,
right,
rather than you find a person and then you start building the story?
Oh no, concept first. A concept, story, and I try to find the right model to there are times where like in a model will fit, but then there are certain specific stories that a specific family that I'm close friends with will be a better suit for that narrative.
So you're thinking of the concept, and then you think, oh, I know somebody who'll be good
Absolutely.
for that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's cool. I'm always curious about the process of how it all comes together. So now these, you have an oracle written on that, what's the larger message that you're saying with that?
So oracle as in, and I think when you look behind you, there's another synonym for that, which is like herald, or medium. So something that I often do is just like look up synonyms for some of these words and try to find different ways to like tell the same story with like different words, which also goes with the grand narrative about judging a book by its color, and like looking at some of these like monochromatic like palettes that I'm branding with like each figure. It's just basically talking about how we approach individuals and like we judge them by the content of the character versus like the outwardly appearance. So I've been using this language as a tool since grad school to like either help add an extra layer to the paintings that I'm creating, and it could be a hit or miss sometimes. And every now and then I'll try to use like an African language, and people were like, what is this saying? And I would have to explain. I'm like, how long do I think I'm gonna like keep using foreign languages? I do get a kick out of it sometimes. I'm like, yeah, you need to like learn something about this African language you haven't heard before. But every now and then I'll just use English as a quick reference or tool for that.
Your earlier work, when you had the same person figure in different ways, and what I got was that you're playing with like the multi-dimension of people's personalities. What's then kind of like your thought of a person and personality?
Using historical or biblical or political narratives, I would often use the character multiple times in the composition. And this started from when I was doing the self-portraits for my undergrad, because I didn't have any models around me. So I think it was like a lack of access to some of these people. So I would end up using them multiple times. And it started creating its own narrative. But the language that I was able to like resolve around that was to highlight the multiple personalities that we have. So oftentimes I'll create a narrative that will have one character sit in as both a friend or a foe, a father and a son, a mother and a daughter, and then it also like behooves the viewer to like step into the shoes, like or the multiplicity of these characters, and empathize with like the villain and the protagonist and the antagonist at the same time. Because I do feel like we all have these like we have the spectrum or like this extremities of personalities that we all inhabit, and it's just a matter of like taming them and just empathizing with people at large. So that's where that came from. And then with the scale of some of these characters, there's this grandiose character in the background and like the little figurines in the foreground. That also comes from this mythology we have in the Ashanti kingdom about dwarfs, and I don't know if that's the appropriate word, but we have these like spiritual, mystical beings that come out only at night, about maybe 2 to 4 feet high, with their feet backwards, so they kind of move in the opposite direction that we would normally move from, and then uh, they are often creatures that are well versed in herbal medicine and like foretelling of the future. So I'm playing with some of these scales, and again, so like it's picking back on some of the spiritual elements from back home and how that could be like a very political figuration in some of these words.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, yeah. I know you've used a lot of kind of like the icon images of the Ashanti Kingdom, and yeah, a lot of different symbols in the earlier work, which is really cool and fascinating. Also, too, there's a lot of plants, like ferns and what's.
Yeah, I had this residency in 2019 at the ISCP in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. This is the International Studio and Curatorial Program. At the Airbnb that I was staying at, I had the privilege of like taking care of about 16 plants, and I think I ended up killing about 2 of those, and I felt bad I had to replace them. But the lady was kind of cool with it. But it just made me think about responsibility outside of my day-to-day practice. Like I got to come home and take care of them, and like I wouldn't have the same level of care for all the plants. I mean, like it wouldn't be the same level of care. Like you gotta, attend to one with its own separate needs. You gotta water it maybe once a week. This one maybe like twice a week. It just made me think about responsibility in a different lens like that. And what I've realized throughout the years is that most of the times the plants in my surroundings are a reflection of my mental state.
Cool.
I could be very zoned in my studio sometimes where I forget to water my plants, and maybe like a month later I'll look up and most of my plants are just like toppling over or die, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, like it's a big reflection of what's happening mentally, and I gotta like snap out of it and just like attend to some of these. But yeah, I've had a good run with incorporating them in the work so far.
Yeah, they even put them in the front window of the ICA. Yeah. Didn't really think about it. Like those external responsibilities are things kind of reflect what's going on in your life. So then for your own definition of yourself and your personality.
Honestly, I don't know if we're gonna answer that.
Yeah, I heard you respond one time and you said that you're an artist, right? But then, so with that identity as an artist, do you feel like there's a social, political, cultural responsibility or duty or a calling or mission or anything like that, or it's more like, yeah, I really, or is it more you're kind of exploring and growing yourself, or a mixture of both? Answer it however you want.
Man, I would say it's a mixture of both. It's funny because growing up, I always have this, and I think it's still even like relevant to this day. This idea that artists are activists, and they are a very big. They have this weight on their shoulders to represent classes, different cultures and people around who haven't had the privilege of being, at the forefront of certain discussions, or just being like, the underclass of society. And like we have the responsibility to like bring these concepts and people and ideas to the forefront, and and in a way it's more like saving society, or just being, being the bigger lens for artists to like, and I could go on and on and on about some of these responsibilities, but I don't think I'm necessarily trying to like tap into that because I've had some of these questions before. Like, are you an activist? I'm like, no, I'm an artist. Are you a black artist? Yeah, I'm a black artist, but I'm not a black artist. I'm just an artist. Like the race, the ethnicity, the color, all that is secondary to me. I think what's more important is that I have the luxury and the room to tell these stories, and that I'm very appreciative of the people and the institutions and the support systems that help grant me some of these accesses to tell these stories of empathy, of love, and of the collective human spirit.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. Awesome. So the collective human spirit, how would you define that or categorize that? What does that mean, the collective human spirit?
More of a collective that is devoid of tribalism. I grew up around it, and I know what it looks like. And unfortunately, I do see that a lot here in the States. Uh, Again, like on an intellectual front, where we are very divisive based on our ideologies, which is a very sad thing because America is like one of the first world countries that professes to have like all this intellectual IQ, predicated on the advancements, but at the end of the day, it still feels the same as some of the tribal experiences that I had from back home. So, what I mean by collective human spirit is like a collection of like-minded people and spirits. Again, I'm using the word spirit, because that is devoid of some of these like external qualities that we have. So I'm thinking about this collective that is devoid of certain divisive tribalistic tendencies.
Yeah. So the chapters of light, um, what message about the empathy and the love and the collective human experience do you want people to take away from this exhibit?
Early on, my work used to be very subtle in its palette. It was very like muted. Mostly browns and dark gray tones. But then things started becoming more vibrant, and most of the response to the work started becoming more about the color palette and how vibrant it is, and how beautiful the green is, and how beautiful the pink is, and you know, in a way, I felt like it might have been taken away from some of the story. I do like the color palette. I also like the people and the subjects behind them. But uh, it's interesting how those two things tie in together. While I'm talking about not judging a book by its cover, and just like relating to an individual who I might render multiple times in the composition. As I'm behooving the viewer to like step into the shoes of this person and just relate to them on a very spiritual level, as opposed to you know what it is they're wearing, or what it is they're professing to be on the outward uh, point of view. But I feel like there are multiple ways of rendering what empathy looks like with some of these gestures. I'm hoping the viewer is able to take away from some of these pieces the calmness and tranquility of some of these subjects, because quite honestly, when I was taking some of these photos with these models this summer, most of them were going through some hellish hell. I mean, with the whole pandemic and everything going on, some of them getting kicked out, some of them being homeless, some of them trying like being financially bankrupt because of like some of the moves that they make. It's like everything is up in the air. But with them being this calm and settled in these narratives, these poses, I'm hoping that the viewer is able to take away something personal that they themselves see.
But yeah, all these you do get. I mean, you want to stand in front of. It does give you a comment and ponder: who is this?
Mm-hmm.
Who are these people? What is their story?
Right.
Cool. All right. So then you would say, okay, the collective human spirit is that it's almost like saying, hey, folks, come on, like we're all human beings. Let's just be human beings. Is that in the sense, like, hey, like screw the tribism and the identified and putting yourself into this camp, and just say like we're humans. Is that it, or
I wouldn't say, yeah. It's not. Again, it's like it's easier said than done. It's also easier to just like paint a narrative, and I'm not trying to say these are like the do's and don'ts of like how we gotta like approach the individuals and like relate to like everyone around us. It's more like a room or space carved out that is void of that language, that is void of some of those ideologies. I don't have that as part of like my language. I come to this with a clean slate. And again, like the only identity politics just that I subscribe to is just like the names of the individual. Like, for example, you might ask me who I am. I would say I'm Conrad, and I'm an artist. I don't care about the gender, the race, the sexuality, the all the extra secondary like baggage that we try to like hold on dearly here in the West as part of like our personality. It's more about the name. Like 20 years down the line, like if I hear your name, what am I going to think about? I'm not going to think about your race. I'm not going to think about It's more like what you did for the people around you and like the community at large. That is more important. And so I think like all our names are much more. It's like richer than gold and richer than ruby. So like it's also like a biblical phrase that talks about the importance of names above all minerals and wealth. So I try not to approach this work as like, hey, this is how we approach a world without tribalism, or here are the do's and don'ts. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to do. It's just like a space devoid of such language, period.
Do you have a driving philosophy or view of life that kind of you always come back to, that kind of like sets you on how you function in the world?
I do, which also comes from my spiritual upbringing from Ghana. Coming from a Christian household, I was like very church oriented. It's just basically like learning how to live a modest life and being content with like the little resources that we have around us and making do of those and creating like a beautiful world around us and solving some of like our biggest problems and questions with like the little that we have. It's not a matter of like acquiring more to like tell the story, or it's like how can I tell a story with like the least that I have, or help other people around me with the least that I have. So I've only been here for like about 11 years now, but I'm always thinking about going back home all the time to just like help some of the communities that I come from back home. I was born in Accra, but I lived in like other villages a little up north in Kumasi, Obuasi, Iburi, and then people ask me all the time, so where do you go when you go back home? Like, do you go to Accra? I'm like, no, it's almost become like America. I'd rather just be in the village, on the grounds with the people. It's a much more humbling experience. So it's something that wakes me up every day too. Like, I'm in the States, I know what luxury feels like. I know like the wealth and the privilege of like having some of these support systems, and but I also know what it feels like with the lack of those. So it's a grounding experience every morning to like wake up and think about the people back home and like how some of these narratives I'm telling will help me like help the people back home. There was this painting I made for a show in MoCAD in 2019. It's called "And Treat Me Not to Leave," and it's a painting with 5 girls who are all sisters, and they are part of like 8 siblings of a guy who was the house taker of an Airbnb I was staying in when I was in Ghana. And he eventually got kicked out as the caretaker of the house, and he had to find a place to like, relocate and move, and he had no job. But with the painting, I was able to use some of those proceeds to help him move. He was able to get like a cab, and like he's actually, full-time working now. And it just makes me think about philanthropy in that sense, and like why I'm doing what I'm doing with like, the work here. I would also eventually like to set up a base back home again, like a studio, and just like work from both places as I can, and just be grounded in who I am. I try not, because I have like lots of friends who come here and like never want to go back home. Like screw home. There isn't anything there. I'm like, that's your foundation. That's where you're from. That's what made you who you are now. So
yeah. So I guess there's something in you that realizes that to give back, I guess, or to actually have what you have to help others.
Yeah. And it all comes from like this massive support system that I have here. That I also have from back home. And this has been part of my philosophy.
Find out more about Conrad Egyir on his Instagram at Conrad_Egyir or on his website, conradegyir.com. His current exhibit, Chapters of Light, at the Institute of Contemporary Art in San Jose, will be on view from October 1st to February 20th, 2022. To find out more about the ICA, go to ica.org. Thank you for listening to the Content Magazine podcast. Follow us on social media at Content Mag. Visit our website to become a member and help us to continue to tell the stories of the local creatives. This episode's music is 408 by Jack Pavlina. Find out more about Jack on his Instagram at Jack Pavlina Music.